At what point did they realize something's going on besides he just got in his vehicle and took off to be alone?
His son arrived at the restaurant, and then he couldn't locate his father. Officer Kimball said, well, let me go check it out. There was blood all over the walls, covering the majority of the walls in the restaurant. And the person who did it was very clever in covering their tracks.
All right. We're going to get to all of that in just a moment. But first, I want you to know how grateful I am for today's podcast sponsor, my friends at FitAF Nutrition. They are Eastern Pennsylvania's leading meal prep company. FitAF offers meals of multiple sizes for people with various health goals. And you know what I love about this company? They use high-quality ingredients like grass-fed meats, wild fish, and locally harvested produce. And all right, for you parents on the go, they even offer family meals. Go to fitafnutrition.com, place your order by Thursday at midnight, and get fresh, prepared meals delivered right to your door on Sunday. Use code RLECKY at checkout and get 20% off your first order.
Here we go, buddy. It's the Ryan Leckey Show.
Welcome back to another episode of the Ryan Leckey Show. This episode, there's a reason why we're on a different set, and it's going to take a different tone. A very serious story, but we're answering a lot of questions I think people had regarding a popular cold case murder that happened in northeastern Pennsylvania. And when I mean popular, I want to say there was a high interest level regarding what happened to Robert Barron. And we wanted to pull back the curtain now that someone's been convicted of his murder and exactly find out from start to finish, how did this case unfold and how did forensic science really change the game? And with us to help pull back the curtain on all of it, Mark Powell, District Attorney in Lackawanna County. For 7 years, you led this from start to finish. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Mark, I want to really do a deep dive on this case. It was a cold case murder for quite some time. It had a huge interest in northeastern Pennsylvania from people saying, what happened to Robert Barron? But for folks who are unfamiliar with the entire story, this all began January 2017. Walk me through it.
I think you first have to understand Old Forge. It's a very small, safe town, pizza capital of the world. Everybody knows everybody, and most people know everybody's business. And back in January of 2017, a very popular restaurant owner disappeared. And it sent shockwaves through the community. From my perspective, I wasn't the DA at the time. I was committed to running for district attorney, but I was in private practice. So I was not involved in the initial investigation. The state police, the Lackawanna County detectives were all involved day one and did a very extensive initial investigation. Murder cases are typically resolved, or at least the suspects are found within a short period of time after a murder. Candidly, between 24 and 48 hours, a lot of the evidence is preserved, and the case is either made or not made. And it doesn't get better over time. It's almost like the tomato on the vine. It typically gets worse as it lingers on. And before I became district attorney, although they did a pretty extensive and thorough investigation, the case had become stagnant. They had suspicions against a few individuals, but they did not have someone they could charge, and we didn't have a body, despite searches, and I mean extensive searches, hundreds of people searching the area for Robert's remains. They never had a body. And you can prove a case without a body, but it becomes more difficult when you understand that the standard to convict someone is beyond a reasonable doubt. If you don't have a dead person, it's very hard to prove murder, but it can be done. It's just a little more challenging to do so. But even beyond not being able to definitively prove someone has died as opposed to run off or been kidnapped or simply wanted to disappear, you don't have the forensic evidence to show what happened to somebody. You just simply have a missing person. Now, ultimately, what happened several years later, despite not having a body, Robert Barron Sr. was determined to be dead. A death certificate was issued, but that was simply because years had passed, and there's a procedure in court where they can go forward and declare someone dead, open up an estate, and do the business end or the administrative end of an estate. But from a forensic standpoint or a crime-solving standpoint, it doesn't solve anything.
And we're going to dive into the crime-solving part of it. So in 2017 of January, when he went missing, at what point did they realize something's going on besides he just got in his vehicle and took off to be alone? Because this is somebody a lot of people knew.
Yeah, he was really loved in the community. He was a generous man, and his family certainly loved and supported him. But the morning that the restaurant was to open, his son, Bobby Jr., arrived at the restaurant, saw a delivery of dough outside the restaurant, which was highly unusual, but they would meet at about 7 or 8 a.m. to begin the dough preparation or making the pizza for later in the evening. And that struck Bobby Jr. as being odd, and then he couldn't locate his father. So he went in the restaurant. Nothing really seemed to be terribly unusual about the restaurant, although Bobby Jr. suffers from OCD, and there were certain things that were bothering him. There was a bleach bottle that was out of place. Now, candidly, in my house, if a bleach bottle was out of place, I wouldn't even pay attention to it or notice it. But with his OCD, he knew something was wrong because it's not the way he left it the night before. But that's a real small clue to jump from something happened to my dad because, a bleach bottle is on a pizza box and not in the closet. He noticed an Afghan downstairs, and that was unusual. So he called. He really thought something happened to his grandparents and maybe his father stepped away. So he was really calling out of concern that something else may be happening, never putting two and two together. But as they called and reached out to family members, his mom, his uncle, so Bobby Sr.'s brother, who was particularly close to the family, they began to realize no one had heard from Bobby Sr. that morning. And that caused concern. Maria Barron, Sr.'s wife, had called a bunch of places, but had visited some of the rental units they had, really trying to search for where he could possibly be, but didn't really think it was appropriate to go to the police with only a couple hours of someone missing. But finally, after a couple hours of coming up short, decided to go to the local police in Old Forge. And Officer Kimball, who works for the police department, said, well, let me go check it out. Let me go to the restaurant. Now, a trained eye is a little different. So when he arrived, despite the restaurant appearing to be relatively normal because there had been substantial cleaning, he began to inspect very closely under the table with a flashlight, examining the tile, and saw specks of blood. And that caused the trained officer to be suspicious. Now, we displayed the photographs at trial, and honestly, you can look at those photographs and it's very, very difficult to see the specks of blood or the smeared blood that had been cleaned. It's almost impossible to see. But as they brought in a forensic team from the state police and began to truly develop a crime scene and take photos of everything that existed, cumulatively you could see more and more blood. And there was blood kind of everywhere, but specks of blood because it had been cleaned up. The state police then used a chemical called luminol. And luminol is a fast-acting chemical that basically lights up blood remains. It's fluorescent. You get about 20 seconds to snap a picture, but it will capture blood staining that's not visible to the human eye. And they spread this luminol literally with a sprayer all over the walls, and what they discovered is that there was blood all over the walls, covering the majority of the walls in the restaurant. So really what they concluded was there was really a bloodbath, a violent assault that occurred in the restaurant. Now, again, not visible to the naked eye because of the cleaning, but visible in being able to be photographed with the luminol, the chemical.
And this is all in Gigerelli's Pizza.
This is right in the bar area of the restaurant, yeah.
Again, a popular place in Old Forge.
Popular place, but not one where you would expect to see a crime scene.
So when you talk about the walls, at this point, are we looking at blood spatter experts getting involved? Walk me through the process, because once you started using the luminol, people started realizing there's something going on.
Yeah, so the luminol would light up areas that had been wiped or cleaned. So it's very hard forensically to make any logical conclusions from a blood pattern that had been smeared or wiped. But there were some other areas, and what happens with blood spatter is you can make conclusions based upon the pattern of blood. And Trooper Hitchcox from the state police was able to give certain opinions. First, there was blood very high on the walls. So that would suggest, above like door tops, that would suggest some type of assault or hitting that would cause blood to spatter and hit a wall, particularly at a higher angle. And then if you examine those droplets, and they're specks because it had been cleaned up, but the specks that remained, if you were to examine those droplets of blood, you could determine the direction of the blood. So, some of the blood would be draining down. That isn't necessarily anything significant, it's just gravity. But when the blood pattern goes upwards, that would suggest that it would be a swiping motion or a motion that would indicate as a result of an assault. And based on that blood pattern, he was able to give certain opinions and conclusions that an assault had occurred.
Were they processing the crime scene, though, right away on this day that he didn't show up to get the pizza dough?
Yeah, yeah, the whole scene was preserved, processed, photographed, and then a very detailed search for any DNA evidence or any physical evidence, like even hair, for example. That if there was a piece of hair, they would capture that, send that to a lab to try to determine if that had any significance.
Was there DNA evidence at the crime scene?
There was a lot of DNA evidence. Unfortunately, it was only of Bobby Sr. There was zero DNA of any other suspect. So that doesn't help in able to prove forensically who did it, but it does suggest that someone who did it was prepared to commit a crime. And you can often preserve that type of forensic evidence simply by wearing gloves, for example, or extensively cleaning. And that allowed us to conclude that the individual who did this prepared to commit a crime because there was no DNA left by any individual who could have caused this violent attack. So we knew what happened. We knew it was a murder. It wasn't a suicide, obviously. We didn't have a body. We didn't have any evidence of suicide. So we knew what happened. We just didn't know who did it. And the person who did it was very clever in covering their tracks, not only ensuring that there was no DNA left, did extensive cleaning of the area in order to remove any evidence of crime, including the blood that ultimately was produced through the luminol, and they removed the body. So from an investigative standpoint, that put some very severe challenges into trying to prove who did this or what exactly happened inside the restaurant.
After processing the crime scene, How long did it take you guys? Because initially I think there was a vibe in the community that this guy is missing and they're trying to find him. How long was it until you released that something suspicious went down to the media and everybody else?
Yeah, so again, this was before my administration, but it didn't take long for rumors to spread, right? First of all, there are 20 or 30 cop cars at Gigerelli's restaurant the morning of the murder. So word spread very quickly, and rumors spread and continue to spread to this day despite the conviction. So it is the type of town where people talk. There are very little secrets. There aren't necessarily truth to all the rumors, but there are a lot of rumors that perpetuate throughout the community. So it was a short period of time when word was out that something happened. But everybody had a theory. Everybody had a theory that, or an opinion as to what happened, that he ran away, or that so-and-so did it and somebody else did it, or that 10 people did it. And that doesn't necessarily help in the crime-solving business, right? What we're looking at is accurate information that we can verify. So it's nice to have tips, but we verify everything. Even when someone comes in and talks to us, we're not just taking their word for it, right? It's trust and verify, but you only trust after you verify. So you're looking at corroborating evidence, whatever that may be. So if Ryan, you came in and you told me what happened, I'd say, that's great. Now let's see your cell phone and see if there are any text messages that corroborate what you're saying. And if you said you were at the UPS store, that's great. Now let's get the video at the UPS store so I know what you're saying to me is truthful. And it's not that we doubt everything, but we know the burden we have to prove, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. And we want to verify everything you're saying. And some information cannot be verified, but we work diligently. Cops do a really good job at trying to verify everything and rule out simply rumors. And throughout this case, really throughout the 6 years until we found the body, there were rumors upon rumors and searches that ended up really resolving in nothing. We searched sewer drains, we searched attics, we chased every lead, because you never know if the lead that you kind of push off is a legitimate lead or not. So there was a tremendous amount of investigative efforts chasing down a whole bunch of leads that unfortunately did not produce any results until ultimately we were able to find the body in March of 2023.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. It seems like January 2017, there's all this work, right? There's an uptick of everything going on with, the forensic lab that came and tested everything, right? And then all of a sudden, things go cold for a while, right? You get these leads, you have no body, right? No weapon.
So initially, right, in 2017, they do a very extensive investigation. They interview witnesses. They get a lot of information, but nothing solid to lead to a suspect, and certainly nothing to establish who they can charge. I come into office in January of 2018, and the case at that point in time had become fairly stagnant. And I
Was
don't
it
mean
considered
that,
a cold case then?
Yeah,
How long does it take to call something a cold case?
Yeah, we don't like using the word cold case, although I know that's popular in the media. They're unsolved cases, so it certainly was an unsolved murder. When is a case cold? It's when all the investigative leads end, and at that point in time, no one ever stopped working on it, but I can assure you there were no more investigative leads to chase. You're waiting for a break. And sometimes that's someone getting arrested and flipping and giving information. We're waiting to get lucky. We're waiting for something to happen. So we never closed our books on it, but we were waiting for some type of break. The problem is the break never came. So when I came into office in January of 2018, I knew this was an unsolved case. We put our team together, some of the initial investigators and then some new folks, seeing if anything could be done. In the meantime, the family has also very proactive in trying to assist in the investigation. Unfortunately, we could not reveal what we were doing even to the family, which created, I think, some frustration on their end, but understandably, we can't share our investigative leads. So they had suspects in mind that we had already interviewed, ruled out, verified where they were, they established alibis, and they're saying, well, why haven't you done this or that? That's just kind of natural because you can't reveal those investigative strategies. However, the family, continued to assist and inquire. They had rewards out, and they were looking for information as well. And if they obtained information, we would chase that down.
And you mentioned earlier, by the way, not to interject here, but there was so many different rumors circulating on what happened to him, et cetera. When did it become public that you guys were confident this was a robbery gone bad? There was that buzz going on.
Yeah, so that was one of the theories early on because we knew, one, it was a cash business, two, that cash was missing, and it was just logical that someone had gone in there with the intent to rob and took it to the next level. The family was very much convinced that the individual who did this did it knowing Mr. Barron was present at the restaurant at the time. We didn't have really sufficient proof to establish that part of it, although it's a logical conclusion or theory. Really, the person could have been surprised by Mr. Barron's presence or gone in there knowing he was there with the idea of confronting him, or simply meeting him as he returned to the restaurant after dropping his son off at home and ambushing him at that point in time. It really didn't matter how the crime occurred because we knew what had occurred once he was in the restaurant, which was this brutal murder and attack and ultimately a robbery.
So we come now to 2018. You're in the district attorney's office. You put together a team. You're starting to dive into this. What happened next? Because it was still years until you found a body.
Yeah, so we review everything from A to Z. We're making sure every I is dotted, every T is crossed. There were some things that we picked up on and decided to pursue, but really nothing led to much early on despite us redoing certain things. So there's always a little bit of loose ends or fresh eyes that see things. And again, we're waiting for some type of break. But we would do this consistently and regularly throughout 2018, 2019, 2020, every year. And every year on the anniversary, the family would be, also very concerned where the case stood, and we would tell them that the investigation is ongoing. We're not giving up, but talk was a little cheap at that point in time because we couldn't share with them exactly what we were doing and what leads we had. But there were a couple key points to the case that ultimately led to its successful prosecution. One, very early on, our phone forensic expert, Cheryl Turner, preserved all the phone information. Now, you're talking back in 2017. So technology back then really isn't what technology is today. And she had the foresight at that time to preserve all the data.
Whose phone?
Everybody who was remotely involved in any aspect of the case. The problem is if there were 5 or 6 providers, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, not every provider back then saved the same information. In fact, only Verizon had saved some of the range-to-tower information that ultimately provide the fruitful information. Other providers didn't have that information, but she preserved everything. But in 2017, the forensic science wasn't there to really do anything with that information. So you get this information dump. We could get text messages, even deleted text messages. We could know activities on phones, but we wouldn't necessarily know the science behind tracking a phone in 2017, which means that cell towers send signals to identify where a phone is at various times randomly. And it's not like a Find My Phone on your app now, where I know that my wife is working in Wilkes-Barre right now because I can track her and she can track me. It's information that would go off a cell phone tower that would give you a band, and the band of location could be several miles long. So it's helpful information, but it's not certainly an exact science. But we had this information preserved, fortunately, but no one, except very few experts in the country, knew what to do with that information. But it was preserved, and that truly ended up being the break we needed that ultimately solved the case in the latter part of, say, 2022, when we started to develop some of this forensic information to use range to tower to locate Schubeck's phone, its activity, ultimately leading to where the body was found in March of 2023.
So let's back up a second. How did you identify Justin Schubeck as a suspect?
So he was a suspect early on.
Why?
Several of these folks who were involved were heavy heroin addicts, including Bobby Jr. So there were a circle of folks that were heavy into drugs.
This is the victim's son?
Yeah, so Bobby Jr., an individual named Pat Boyle, an individual named Jason Sestola, and Justin Schubeck were all heavy heroin users. And they would sell to each other, they would use with each other, and they all lived next to each other. And so that drug activity amongst those group led us to believe that they could be involved in the robbery.
And are these people who have been convicted of drug use?
So several of those individuals have criminal histories. Mm-hmm. All of those individuals freely admit that they were heavy into heroin at the time. And if there's any kind of light or hope from all of this, many of those individuals are clean and sober to this day after January of 2017. They really turned their life around. And candidly, had fentanyl been as present as it is today back in 2017, I suspect most of them would have overdosed and not been around. But back then, the heroin was a little purer, not as lethal, but they were heavy users at the time.
So you have Justin Schubeck, though. He's one of several suspects that was always on your radar.
Always on the radar, always a suspect, always someone of interest, I guess is the best way of putting it, with several of these other individuals.
So then 2023, as you describe as a case maybe that had been stagnant, all of a sudden things are heating up, and it's because of cell phone technology and forensic science linked to that.
Yeah.
But you guys got the FBI involved.
Right. So, this gets a little bit into the weeds, but when we reached out to the FBI for their assistance, they would assist and guide us and give us direction on what to do. And that caused us then to obtain the cell phone information. So it was preserved, it wasn't going anywhere, but then you had to obtain it. And the protocol at the time to obtain it was to go in and get a court order to obtain it. And this, this information is protected by the Fourth Amendment. There are privacy issues involved in it. So it's somewhat controversial, but there are two areas of cell phone data that are used. Range to tower, which is ultimately what we used and were able to bring into court, and geofencing, or kind of blocking off a whole area and getting all cell phone activity, even people who weren't a suspect or weren't involved. And that's what's controversial and not allowed in courts, because that violates individuals' privacy rights. But the cell to tower information was evolving. The case law was evolving. And we actually sent an order to Verizon for the cell-to-tower information via a court order. They didn't comply. And a couple weeks went by. And in that small window of time of a couple weeks, a United States Supreme Court case came down and said, you can't obtain this data from a search warrant, or from a court order, you need a search warrant. So had we obtained that information as we requested it, it likely would have been suppressed because of that Supreme Court case. Because we didn't get it timely, we immediately sent a letter based on this new case to stop our request. Please don't send it to us. Immediately got a search warrant, which is the proper vehicle in order to obtain the data, and got the search warrant to obtain the data in order to survive a suppression issue. So we were able to use the data, but it was that close in time, literally weeks. And had we requested it, looking back in hindsight, by a court order in, say, 2019, it all would have been suppressed and not being able to use in court because of this subsequent United States Supreme Court case.
So here we are, 2023, though. You're looking at utilizing the cell phone technology. You mentioned you had several suspects. Justin Schubeck was one of them. Were you utilizing this on all the people who were on your radar? Because ultimately his data is what led you to the body.
We were exploring all options, right? When you investigate a case, you do a kind of a shotgun approach, and you try to obtain information on everybody, even family members. I mean, we were doing this with the daughters who consented to phone searches, and we never suspected them of being involved in any way, shape, or form with their father's disappearance. But you cast a broad net, but you then rule out suspects, and in this case, Verizon, which was Justin Schubeck's provider, was the only one who had the range tower information that we could use. And that in itself was pretty fortunate. But the other providers for the other individuals didn't even have that data. So based on that data, we relied on the FBI, who then fine-tuned the range to tower information. And again, it gets a little technical, but if you had several towers, you could narrow the focus of where someone would be. So, and typically you have several towers so you don't drop calls. So there's overlapping towers that capture your cell phone activity. So if you're just relying on one cell phone, you could have maybe a 5-mile band you're searching. But if you have one tower in one direction and another tower in another direction, that crisscross could narrow the focus of where the ping to the tower is and more narrowly locate where the phone is. So the FBI agent was able to piece a lot of that information together to try to track where Schubeck had spent a lot of his time on the evening of the murder, particularly from about 11 p.m. till 3 a.m. in the morning, and then from about 6 a.m. the following morning till about 9 a.m. the following day. And based on that information, we decided to do another search of the area. It was a similar area that had been searched before unsuccessfully. We were doing it with the same amount of people, about 200 officers from all different levels, Game Commission, State Police, New York State Police, a lot of the local detectives and police officers to conduct this search. But it is an area of about 1,200 acres. Put that in perspective, that's about 900 football fields we're trying to search. When they did that search in 2017, they're truly searching for a needle in a haystack. They didn't have much direction. They had a general idea of what to do, and they never discovered where the remains were. When we did it in 2023, first we waited for the ideal conditions. The spring is when the woods come alive, and in particular some of the aromas come alive, which helps with the cadaver dogs and able to identify certain remains as opposed to other times of the year. The forest is typically clearer. You don't have the leaves in yet, so there's more visibility. And we recruited our neighbors, the state police canine unit, because their dogs are trained on bones versus flesh, and they're a little better at finding remains when there's a skeletal remain as opposed to a fresh body. And they were gracious enough to just send their whole team down to assist in this search. So that ended up being a key factor in the search.
How narrow was the search thanks to the cell phone technology? Because if you said you were looking at 900 football fields back in the day.
It's the same area. So we were covering 1,200 acres. Mm-hmm. We had a 2-day search planned. We had 4 phases of searches to extend over those 2 days. So we were covering all the areas within those bands. But we had a briefing in the morning. The FBI agent gave us all instructions. Everybody was ready to search. And the canine unit said, listen, we want to bring the dogs in first, so there's not human scent in the woods yet. And the dogs get tired. I mean, they'll work, but they get tired. They'll need a rest. Where do you suggest we start? Because they're going to be best in the morning. It's only going to get harder for them that first day. And that FBI agent said, I suggest starting here, which was a smaller location in the mass 1,200 acres. So the first phase, but a very particular area.
Because of cell phone technology.
Because of his forensic review. And the day before, we had mapped the area with flags. So we put yellow flags to identify the parameters. Don't go outside the yellow flags. This is the area that we're searching. And then we put red flags at the center of the band to give you an idea. Because again, it's not exact science of where an area pangs that is where you're going to find anything. It's the bands are wide and the bands are long. But we had these flags all kind of mapped out to give people a visual direction. So that morning, we all met at about 6 in the morning. I was on standby, but I was going to go back to the office and wait word. And by the time I left the command center in Pagnotti Field in Old Forge to make my 10 or 15 minute commute back to the office, they had identified human remains. It was that quick, that morning. So in less than 20 minutes, within about 20 feet of one of those red flags, they identified the femur bone of Mr. Barron. Now, at that point, all we know is human remains, and
Right.
we only find a femur bone. We have to confirm that by DNA. It's very difficult to even have DNA in a skeletal remains 7 years later because the bones deteriorate, animals destroy the bones, animals scattered the remains. But we had an intact femur, your leg bone, which was very promising in order to get DNA. And based on that, we were able to ship that to Green's, to the lab in near Pittsburgh, and confirm DNA evidence. Now, we continued that search for 2 days, and we found other skeletal remains. We didn't find a complete skeleton, but we found remaining skeletal remains of Robert Barron Sr. And that's when we had the assistance of the anthropologist, Dr. Dirk Matt from Mercyhurst College, world-renowned forensic anthropologist, who first confirmed visually that it was human remains, because They're distinct, but honestly, we also discovered a lot of skeletal remains from deer and other animals that clearly weren't human remains, and it takes a trained eye to know that. And it was also helpful based on his experience as to once we identified where the body was, then where would the remaining parts of the body be if there was kind of animal interaction kind of tearing apart the bones. He then sent a team of forensic scientists from Mercyhurst the next day. Now, we had searched that whole day, identified and flagged body remains, but he then sent a team of forensic specialists in. And when I tell you, they were down on hands and knees. They removed every leaf from the forest where they were searching. They were sifting through dirt and trying to find anything and everything that would resemble a human bone in order to track the location to ultimately find all we could find. Unfortunately, despite all those heroic efforts by not only the 200 volunteers who searched the woods, but this forensic team from Mercyhurst, we were never able to locate the skull. And the skull does a few things for us. It would certainly confirm any type of trauma, and dental records could be used to further identify an individual if we were not successful with the DNA. We didn't have that. Fortunately, we were able to confirm the DNA from the femur bone. Dr. Dirkmatt then took all of those remains back to Mercyhurst, developed charts of what remains of the body were there, what was missing, and provided opinions that, based on his expertise, that these were in fact the human remains of Robert Barron Sr.
So you confirmed that, and at what point did you say, we're going to arrest Justin Schuback?
So once we got the DNA,
what was the timeline from when you started finding the remains? He identifies that college professor guru, right? Identifies that this is Robert Barron, to you said, we're going to make an arrest.
Yeah. So that happened within about 48 hours. Typically, to get DNA results on an investigation, you are usually waiting 4 to 5 months in order to get the lab work done. With the assistance of the state police and the fact that they had all the DNA evidence of Robert Sr., we were able to get those results within 24 hours. And so based on that information, we were then able to make their arrest because the body was found right in the close proximity to where Justin Schuback was. Now, with all that said, I can tell you that before the search, there was a lot of pressure to make the arrest based on some information we had, with the theory that, one, you don't need a body to prove murder. Two, if you make the arrest, potentially Schuback would confess, and we would able then to identify the body based on his information.
Can you share what that evidence was?
Sure. I mean, it's all the evidence that came out in trial, but we did know that Schuback had some DNA in an automobile that we knew that Barron was transported in. We knew Schuback, who didn't have a job, didn't have any money, was dope sick, was out buying heroin the night of the murder. So, we at this point in time had really ruled out many of these other individuals, primarily because they cooperated, provided alibis, or provided corroborating evidence to establish that they were not, in fact, involved in the crime. They may have been dealing drugs, but our focus was on solving a murder, not making arrests for drug transactions, and we gained their cooperation early on in the investigation. So we had really narrowed the focus as to the one suspect, but didn't have a body. There was a push to make the arrest without the body. In fact, the family really said, please, please make the arrest. We'll understand if we don't get the conviction. We want the arrest. I certainly took everybody's opinions to heart, but at the end of the day, we had waited 6 years at that point in time. I wanted to make sure that when we did make the arrest, it was going to be bulletproof and we were going to be able to obtain the conviction. And there would be nothing worse than making an arrest, not getting a conviction, and then finding the body. So cognizant of all those facts, knowing that Schuback had not been forthright in any of the other interviews that he provided, despite a tremendous amount of pressure, said, no, we're going to conduct the search first, and then we'll make a decision on the arrest. And fortunately, throughout that search process, we were able to identify the body. So the decision to arrest at that point in time was imminent. In fact, even considered to arrest without finding the body. But as soon as we found the body, it was pretty instantaneous. Now, we still had to do it properly because Schuback lived so close to where the body remains were. We were certain that he saw all the activity. I mean, you couldn't
And where were they
miss
found again?
the activity in Pagnotti Field, which is a part of Old Forge, close to the Duryea border, but very close to Schuback's home. And so we like, even when we put an unmarked car to watch the area, because even when we found the femur, we didn't announce anything publicly because we wanted to continue the search the next day. Rumors had already gone through the town that the remains were found. I mean, it's just hard to keep that kind of secret under wraps. And so we had unmarked cars placed in the area so no one would affect the integrity of the crime scene at night. We had people in the woods guarding the area, but that type of activity certainly would tip somebody off that things were happening. And so we were very concerned in making that arrest that we did it safely and securely. So we did that with the appropriate backup and had our SWAT team available to come in and make the arrest at the appropriate time the next day.
And there were reports it took almost a year to get that cell phone data to track exactly where Justin Schuback was.
Yeah.
Why so long?
So because the technology really wasn't there at the time. So fortunately it was preserved, but many would not even have preserved that type of information in 2017. And I'm not quite certain that when it was preserved, our detective, as good as she is, knew what she was preserving, but she knew well enough to preserve everything. So it was preserved. Then as the technology developed and we were getting instruction by the real expert and the FBI agent to try various techniques with it and get certain data, is when the information began to unravel. And those type of investigations take time. The amount of work from the FBI agent took months and months to produce. It's not something simply, to take the data and read it and understand it. It has to be mapped out. It has to be verified, and they make sure that the science is accurate. And then once you even get the information, now you're looking for that corroborating evidence to show that the data is correct. So it's one thing to say, this is the science, this is the latest thing, members of the jury want you to buy it. Juries are really good at analyzing evidence, and they don't just buy conclusions. They look for the process. And so when you can say, we know that the defendant was moving from the area the car was to his home on the next day, that's one way of doing it, through the cell tower information. When we ultimately find him on a video in a restaurant at a gas station at the exact same time, we now have the cell phone data plus the video evidence to show that he was there. So it fits together. It builds upon one another. So you're looking at other evidence to support the data. Finding the body based on the cell phone data proves the cell phone data is accurate. Finding a video of where somebody is, and these are random security videos.
And they kept them that long?
Well, yeah, yes and no, right? Some did, some did not, but all of them were exhaustively searched. And we were able, so some of it we were able to preserve timely. So we knew that the evening of the murder, there was a drug transaction between Schubeck, the defendant, and this gentleman named Pat Boyle. And they did that at a UPS store. So we were able to go to UPS, get that video for pretty timely. Years later, we were able to obtain video from Aries gas station where Schubeck had walked back the morning after the crime, where we believe that he buried the body in the daylight after dumping the car. And we took a logical place from where the car was to his home, followed that pattern, found a business establishment, and said, geez, I wonder if there's any video. They had the video, and sure enough, Schubeck was walking down the street, went into the gas station, and was captured there. And interestingly, he was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt, and it had an emblem on it, so it was easily identified. When we ultimately did the search of his home, again, months later, we were able to retrieve that sweatshirt. Now, it was months later, clean, there was no DNA, but this sweatshirt that seemed to be relatively new had the sleeves cut off. In the video, the sleeves were there. When it was retrieved, the sleeves were cut off. His girlfriend had no explanation as to why the sleeves would be cut off on that sweatshirt. So a logical conclusion would be that it had some type of evidence that he couldn't clean or couldn't do anything with other than destroy, and rather than throw away the sweatshirt, he cut the sleeves off. So it's all a building block and little pieces of information, but between the sweatshirt, sleeves cut off, the video, and the cell at the tower, it all just makes perfect sense as to where he was, particularly when we know where we found the car and we know where he lived.
So, of course, we're going to dive into more of 2023. What happened the night of the arrest? You mentioned building blocks, building that case for trial, how it all played out in the courtroom. What was it like picking the actual jury, and how Justin Schubeck's defense focused on the possibility that somebody else other than Schubeck was involved in the murder of Robert Barron, and how the murder conviction came about. More on that in part 2.